Welcome back, everyone. The good news is we had about 120 people for our morning presentation, and would like to welcome you now to our first panel of the day. The panel is titled A Public Service Workforce for the Future, and I'd like to introduce you briefly to our panelists, and their fuller bios are in the program booklet that you should have received when you entered. To my immediate right is Dave Slyke. Dave is a vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton, a graduate of the Maxwell School, and brand new to the Maxwell Advisory Board. Next to Dave is Andrew Cohen. Andrew is a professor of history and the Dr. Walter Montgomery and Marion Gruber Professor in the Maxwell School. Next to Andrew is Andrew Maxwell. He's the former Director of Policy and Innovation for the City of Syracuse and is currently a visiting scholar at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry and a Maxwell School graduate with his MPA in 2006. And next to Andrew is Tina Nabachi. She's a professor of public administration and international affairs here at the Maxwell School, teaches one of our most popular courses in public administration and democracy, and this theme is highly resonant of some of the content that she talks about in that class. She will be our timekeeper and moderator for the session, and I'm going to turn it over to Tina, and thank you to each of you for participating.
Great, thank you, Dave. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's panel. Given the number of smiling faces in the audience, it's clear that you all enjoyed this morning's keynote address by the Honorable Christine Todd Whitman. Governor Whitman is certainly a hard act to follow, but I'm sure with this panel of esteemed colleagues here, our session will be wonderful. We're going to start off this panel by hearing 4 different takes on the issues of citizenship and public service. So we'll start off with Dr. Andrew Cohen, then we'll move to Mr. Andrew Maxwell, Mr. David Slyke, and then I will follow up. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Tina. I'm honored to be here to speak to you about the future of public service. Of course, I'm a historian, so I'm a little bit inappropriate to the task. I hope that giving you a little perspective historically on the public service will help us understand where things are going. And my particular concern today is to talk about the relationship between public service and the structure of social class in the United States historically. The United States was, in the 19th century, the best educated country in the world by far. We were the first country to have a public education system. And the consequence of that is there were a large population of people who wanted white-collar employment. And one of the few bodies that would employ anyone in white-collar work, clerical work, was the United States government and local governments who hired clerks. But the problem was particularly acute for certain populations, and I'm thinking here of African Americans in particular. In the 19th century United States, there was a significant black middle class or upper class of educated folks who sought white-collar employment, and basically no one in business would hire them. It was very rare for them to find private sector employment. They complained bitterly that even abolitionists would not necessarily hire them to their mercantile concerns. So in 1861, when Abraham Lincoln hired the first African-American clerk to the New York Custom House, Robert Vosburgh, it was an enormous big deal, and the subsequent employment of African-Americans in federal service became a standby for the African-American community. Educated African-Americans turned particularly to the federal government, but also to local governments, to find a place where they could find white-collar employment. This is no less true of women. It's little known, but nonetheless true, that during the United States Civil War, one of the reasons why the North had a stronger, it was stronger than the South, was because of their ability to leverage the large population of educated women. And they began hiring those women in the federal workforce, in the Treasury Department in Washington, and eventually in other departments in Washington. Now, at that time, women were not hired in white-collar work in the private sector. It was very uncommon. Most secretaries were, in fact, men. Almost all clerks were men in the private sector. So the federal government and then local governments are actually the leading edge in hiring women to do white-collar employments. But the more I thought about it, the reality is that, in fact, virtually every middle-class person I know is touched historically, genealogically by the public workforce. What I mean by that is when I think of my own ancestors, virtually all of them at some point worked in the public sector. And I think if you think back of your parents, your grandparents, you'll realize that it's very common that if you're middle class now or upper class now, you had some predecessor who worked for government. My grandmother was a secretary in the Social Security Administration. My grandfather worked for the Board of Recreation. My mother was a public school teacher at one point. I mean, again, it goes on and on. And then I thought about my wife. It's not just my family, but my wife had a police officer as an ancestor. And then you start counting school teachers, and you realize how the middle class is in a very real sense built upon the public sector workforce. It's the backbone, in a way, of the American middle class. Now that reflects the fact that during the 20th century, the public sector workforce grew dramatically. To give you a metric, in 1910, 3.37% of workers were working for the government. In 1970, that number was over 11%. So we see an increase in the number of people working in the public sector, and that touches all of our lives. And again, it becomes a substantial sector of America's middle class. And so what I want to leave you with in the short time I have is the question of, is the decline of the middle class argued about in the newspapers and documented by things like the Pew Research, who claims that the middle class has gotten smaller since 1970, the upper middle class has grown, the very elite have grown as well. Is that in some way related to the decline in government employment, which we've seen since 1975, and it's a substantial decline. It's declined about 21% in that period. And so to think about this question of to what extent historically has the middle class itself been built upon public service, and conversely, to what extent is the sort of growing stratification of American society itself a product of the decline in public employment as a percentage of workers.
Great. Thank you very much. Now we'll turn it over to Mr. Andrew Maxwell.
Thank you, Tina. And first I want to thank Dean Van Slyke and the Maxwell School, as well as Terry and Napa for putting today's program together, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. And I want to acknowledge Governor Whitman's remarks and certainly her reference to the importance of local government. I want to echo that endorsement. And that's the context that I bring to this panel this morning in my work over the last decade or so is in local government here in Syracuse and Onondaga County. And in my experiences in government on the administrative side, as well as politically running for mayor this year, I hope that both of those experiences will speak to a couple different elements of this discussion that I'd like to particularly emphasize. The first is sort of the professional or technical element and how we see that evolving across government and in public service. The second part I want to emphasize is sort of the cultural evolution. But first on the professional side, and this is what the Maxwell School does so well. It trains and empowers people to enter the workforce, be it in government or the nonprofit sector or the private sector, to contribute to civic life in a variety of ways, bringing skills and techniques that really reinforce this message of having evidence-based policy making as the foundation for how we advance civic discourse and policy making within communities. And I've seen that in my own experiences here in Syracuse. Working in city government, part of what I've done recently is in creating an innovation office at Syracuse City Hall. And this is really about bringing new skills and new techniques to the way that we do local government. And I think a lot of the practices that we see in that space are things that are often well incentivized or structured in the private sector in terms of investing in innovation. And the government context, especially in local government, is much, much different, where municipal organizations are stretched, their resources are stretched more than ever before, and in city government here in Syracuse, an organization of about 1,800 people, we were not employing anyone focused on data science or data analytics. We didn't have people doing meaningful work with geospatial analysis. There are all sorts of elements of expertise that are brought to other sectors of work that need to be brought to the government sector, especially in local governance, in ways that it hasn't before or hasn't yet. And hopefully I can bring to the panel some discussion of those techniques on the professional side. The cultural side, I won't belabor because I know that we'll speak a lot more about it on this panel and throughout the day, is the cultural evolution in terms of how we view public service. And I think now is a time where we have an opportunity for a new generation to redefine what it means to be engaged in civic life. Coming away from the presidential election, we see all sorts of new energy around engagement and political participation. This is an opportunity to redefine certain things that I think have become sort of toxic in the national discourse about politics. And I think people often will decide, or in their own minds see politics as something separate from the larger national life. And I think that separateness has led to some of the disengagement that the governor made reference to. Low participation in elections at all levels. This is, I think, an opportunity for a new generation to take up the banner of public service and civic engagement in ways that I think the Maxwell School really represents, and ideas about working in government and what that means. People sort of painting that with a particular brush, that working in government is not exciting work, and that people in government aren't bringing the sort of energy and skills that we see in the private sector. I know we'll speak today to the sort of cross-sector and multidisciplinary approaches that we're experiencing now in government. We absolutely have to continue that, and I know that at Maxwell we're growing the leaders who are bringing that to the work of government. And so changing the culture is important. The last thing I'll say before moving on is to reflect both the professional and technical discussion and the cultural discussion is when we started the innovation group at City Hall here in Syracuse, we were hiring for 3 positions. Not a big office, but when we were going through the process of bringing on these sort of non-traditional skills into that team, we had over 320 applicants for 3 spots in a relatively small city. I think that speaks to the commitment that people of this generation feel toward public service and bringing non-traditional skills to that work. So those are the 2 elements I think I'd like to emphasize most today and speak to as the panel moves on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And to you, Mr. Slyke.
Yeah, thank you also for inviting me. This is a great honor to come back to Syracuse. I always love coming back, and this is a topic that is particularly important to me. I've spent 25 years, I sometimes am ashamed to admit now, that I am a career consultant, right? So I've spent 25 years working with the federal government, and only the federal government, so I haven't done state and local work and things like that. And I've worked with probably 20 different federal agencies over the course of my career. And I wrote down some great talking points last night, and as I looked at them, I realized probably not a lot of great context for what I'm about to say. So I'd like to describe briefly the client I serve every day. My client has the unenviable task of implementing the Affordable Care Act. I work for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. They've not been in the news at all in the last 7 years, right? and I think that, and the client's an interesting client from a couple of perspectives when you think of stereotypes of federal employees. This is a group that is highly educated. I rarely meet a person at CMS that doesn't have a master's degree or above. A lot of clinicians, doctors, et cetera. It's a staff that deeply cares about the mission they serve all the time. And whenever they talk to us as their partners, their consultants, that's the first thing that comes out of their mouth. It's not how much money do you have or what kind of support can we have. It's always about the clients they support. The other thing that's really interesting about CMS is they're not a DC-based agency. They're in Baltimore. And they take a lot of pride in that. Every Friday, if you go to CMS, they're all wearing Ravens jerseys, and it's a pretty entertaining. You see the most senior people in the agency wearing Ravens jerseys around. But what's most interesting is this agency, which controls somewhere between 40 and 50% of the federal spend in the government, has under 5,000 employees. 140,000 contractors support them. That is a huge gulf when you think about what you think about in terms of public service. And the consultants that support them play a variety of roles. Consultants and contractors and role providers to get paid. Firms like mine provide a lot of strategy support, and we've been doing a lot of program development. There are people that build IT systems for them. But when you think about that ratio, I wonder sometimes to myself, is CMS sort of is it the future, or is it just an anomaly? Because the size of the workforce matched against the budget is startling to me. And when I think of my clients, I wrote down 5 things that I think, and I think they touch on some of the things you described, that really affect them and how we help them. And the first is this idea of resource constraints. Budgets are not going up. My client's operating under a hiring freeze today. So every day that goes by, they have less and less resources to deal with from a human capital perspective. And so contractors play, I think, a vital role in helping fill some of that gap, both with expertise, which is important, but sometimes, frankly, just arms and legs to help them get things done. A lot of them have limited exposure outside their direct environment. So when the Affordable Care Act was passed, one of the most interesting things is it forced my clients, CMS and the IRS, to start to work together. And they never really worked together before. And there was a lot of confusion about roles and responsibilities, whereas my organization, we work with the IRS every day. I think we were a pretty important bridge to help the 2 agencies understand each other's culture, perspective, et cetera. The third, and I think this cannot be underestimated, and I think it's come up in a couple of topics today, is there's 2 decision dilemmas that I see occurring today for clients. One is there's a high degree of uncertainty and interdependency, but there's more and more pressure to make decisions faster, right? So there's this, I have less information and I have to make decisions now. What's really interesting about that is then everyone says, well, we'll go do data science. I'll go hire a couple of SAS programmers and that'll solve the problem. What's really interesting is there is an unbelievable absence of useful data out there today. There's an avalanche of not very useful data, right? But there is no real useful data. And where useful data exists, it's not put together across agencies. So I've been very heartened to hear 2 people mention evidence-based policymaking. I've heard it more here than I hear it in DC often now, right? It's very important because to me, unlocking the power of data can help solve these dilemmas, but I think we're far away from getting truly useful data. So let me give you a quick example from my client. Medicaid data has traditionally a 3-year lag. 3 years in a government program is an eternity, right? So how are you going to make programmatic decisions with the 3-year lag? The fourth, and I think this is important, is I perceive that the distance between the public sector and the citizen is actually shrinking. So I think citizens want to engage more with government than they wanted to. Before it was, well, there's a bureaucrat in Washington doing something. And I think today, citizens want to directly engage. And I have an interesting little story that I think of in healthcare, where I work today, is all the debates about healthcare today are public sector, private sector, should it be single payer, or should we go to a more market-oriented approach? And all those are very interesting. And what's really beautiful about the healthcare system is it's either perfect or ugly, depending on how you look at it. 50% of the bills in this country, healthcare bills, are paid for by the government, and 50% are paid for by the private sector, which makes it virtually impossible to blow up, right? That's the real fundamental challenge, right? The one person we never talk about ever is the consumer in healthcare. It never comes up. So when you think of citizen, I'll say a citizen is a consumer, and every one of us is a consumer of healthcare, and every one of us is a citizen. We ran a simulation about a year ago, April 2016. We wanted to understand what was going to happen after the election around changing healthcare payment. What was going to start to break that cost curve? And we came up with a black swan scenario. We really wanted to test our people who participated in the simulation. There were 27 executives from the healthcare industry. And our black swan scenario number 1, remember this was April 2016, was that Donald Trump would win the presidency. So it worked out pretty well for us. So the game plan, many of them thought that was ludicrous, right? So the other thing that we put there was that there would be a revolt by consumers about changes in healthcare. And I was sitting there watching members of Congress go home after the first of these zombie bills, repeal and replace, was put forward, and watching citizen engagement there, which seemed pretty active, and it seemed to really influence the debate from where I sit. And as an agency who would be the receiving party for a lot of the change, I think citizen empowerment changed the trajectory of the issue dramatically. I think had citizens not engaged, we would have had a repeal and replace bill. And then the last thing, and I promise to close on this, is I think the issue raised around analytics earlier was interesting. And one of the things we're starting to see is a drive beyond even analytics to what can be automated inside the government. So when you think of the future of the workforce, my general perception is going to be there are going to be less people working in government, but they're going to have to be a heck of a lot smarter and more versatile. than they are today. So when you think about machine intelligence and things like automation and artificial intelligence and immersive learning, I work on a project today where we're helping the government look at 8,000 RFI comments that were submitted to my agency. And we're using natural language processing to sort through those. And the first question we got from the government, which is a totally legitimate question, is how confident are you that you are actually going to pick these things up? And we weren't sure. So in our first run, we had a government analyst look at it. We had one of our analysts who wasn't steeped in healthcare look at it. And we had our Skynet look at it, right? Our machine look at it. And what was really interesting is after 3 runs, we were at 80% of where the government analyst was. So 80% confidence that we'd hit it. And that is a baby step compared to where machine intelligence takes us over time, right? So I think that's going to be an interesting part of the workforce from my perspective in the private sector. We're looking for people who can be facile with data because we think that's the future. We're looking for people that have critical thinking skills because these are multivariable problems we're dealing with all the time. And so when I think of a school like Maxwell, which brings a lot of interdisciplinary attention to how students are developed in critical thinking, to me, as someone who hires, probably on average, my firm probably hires, well, we hired 120 university students, masters and undergrads last year, just in my market. That's the type of skills we're really looking for. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. So Dean Van Slyke asked me to speak about 3 things this morning. The changing patterns of governance, what these new patterns mean for education and jobs in the public service, and the implications of these changes for my research, teaching, and service. Those of you who know me know that I have a lot to say on these issues, but I promise to keep my comments short and sweet, if you also understand that I only have a few minutes to make my point. So first, let me say a few things about the changing patterns of governance. To say that public governance is changing is neither new nor profound. Anybody who's paid a modicum of attention knows that the last several decades have seen major shifts in how public governance, how the work of government is carried out. Government used to provide goods and services directly, but today government at all levels, federal, state, local, even international, is increasingly relying on indirect administration, the use of non-governmental organizations, whether in the private sector or the public sector, to provide goods and services. Indeed, by one estimate, by the early 2000s, over 70% of the work of the federal government was carried out by indirect means. The causes of these shifts in governance are numerous. Globalization, decentralization, and the devolution of responsibilities. Huge constraints on public money and on public resources, increasing demands from the citizenry for public goods, public actions, public services. Ideological views about the supremacy of business as compared to government and the consequent elevation of efficiency as this primary value, and a whole other set of ideological views about needs for local control, about choice and voice, about self-determination, and so much more. Coupled with those shifts are growing realizations about the nature of the problems that we face. We used to talk about solving problems. Today, we can only talk about addressing problems in better and worse ways. This might be an unpopular thing to say, but so many of the problems we face as society, and indeed as humanity, are unlikely to ever be solved. Wicked problems from climate change and its environmental, social, and economic impacts, to education and the changing demands of the labor market, to poverty, hunger, disease, and so much more, are unlikely to ever be solved. We can only think about addressing these in better and worse ways. These and other changes in governance have required different patterns of thinking, of organization, and of action. They've required us not just to think about the use of hierarchy in markets, but also about the use of collaborative arrangements where actors are working across sectoral, jurisdictional, organizational, and other boundaries to address problems. And these changes have important implications for how we educate and train people for the public service workforce. In my opinion, it's no longer sufficient for education and training to focus on core managerial competencies or professionalized sub-areas such as budgeting, financial management, strategic planning, human resources. We can no longer focus on these narrow, specialized subfields such as policy analysis, security, nonprofits, conflict analysis, and so on. Certainly, the public service needs those and other traditional skills, but they also need so much more. The public service workforce needs to perform in light of increasing limitations on resources, increasing hostility towards government, increasing complexity of problems. The public service workforce needs to be able to effectively address and handle rapid and unexpected change. Its members need to be adaptable, flexible, and resilient, and comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty, and interdependence. The public service workforce needs to understand the problems of integration within teams, organizations, cross-boundary collaborations, and society more generally. And they need to have the skills to effectively engage in the ethic of social compromise and democratic determinations. These realities require us to train the public service workforce, both those who are in place now and those who aspire to future positions in the public workforce, in issues of social influence and power, the distribution of power, and the ethical obligations that come with their positions of power. We need to train these people in systems thinking and prepare them to be effective members of problem-solving teams, problem-focused teams, and collaborative endeavors. We need to give them concomitant skills, abilities, and knowledge, things like understanding team and group development, conflict resolution, how you initiate, activate, and sustain collective activities, how you effectively engage with the public, among others. And most importantly, I believe we need to train the public service workforce to be change leaders in both thought and action. To steal a phrase from my colleague Lisa Amsler, we need to train the public service workforce to think Da Vinci, to be lateral thinkers, to move fluidly across environments and perspectives, to take knowledge from one context and apply it to another, and to foster creativity and innovation. And my perspectives on this have certainly influenced my research, teaching, and service, but I don't want to talk about that. Sorry, Dean Van Slyke. If anyone is really curious, you can find my CV online. It's pretty boring. Instead, I want to close with some editorial comments because I have a lot to say on these issues. So first of all of us who train people for the public service, we need to understand, and we need to help our students understand, that the hard and soft skills they learn in programs only matter if they understand the broader political, social, and cultural environment in which governance takes place. This means that we need to convey the fact that values matter and that public values ought to shape the work of the public service and shape what we do in governance. And when values are in conflict, as they so often are, our students need to have the ability to engage in higher order thinking and ethical reasoning to address problems. Second, we as educators need to work very hard to avoid the us versus them mentality that has become so pervasive in society. We can't heroize one sector and vilify another, as Dean Van Slyke has said, but instead have to recognize that all sectors, and indeed all people, can contribute in meaningful ways to the betterment of our organizations, our communities, and our societies. We need to work across ideological and partisan divides to protect the vitality of citizenship and democracy. We need to learn to disagree without being disagreeable. Respect, dialogue, efforts to find mutual understanding. I believe these things are going to be increasingly important as we move through the 21st century. Third, in my view, going into the public service and doing work in the public interest is one of the most noble career choices you can make, whether you're in government, nonprofits, political arenas, private arenas. And more than ever, we need a cadre of well-trained, dedicated, motivated public servants. And this means, as a society, we have to move away from bureaucracy bashing. We have to stop denigrating government. We have to stop demeaning public servants. As professionals and as educators, we have to make the public service appealing again. Or as I like to say, we have to put the rock back in bureaucracy. Deserved more of a laugh than that, but that's okay. Finally, we need to realize, and we need to help others realize, that for better or worse, public governance affects almost every aspect of our lives, from the toothpaste we use, to the taxes we pay, to the food you're going to eat for lunch after this session, to our opportunities for health, education, personal advancement. Without governance, we do not function as a society, and ultimately, governance has to be about more than management, more than budgeting, and more than policy analysis. Ultimately, governance is normative and values-driven, and the members of our public service workforce, which I would suggest includes all of us, need to think about the broader good. We must address public values and the public interest. We must deal with the unquantifiable, and we must seek to make ethical and sound decisions that seek to make the world a better place. So, thank you. With those notes, I probably went over my time. I think I'm the only one on the panel that exceeded the time limit. We've heard four very different perspectives on the future of the public service workforce, from the history of the civil service and its impact on various groups and opportunities, to the changing nature of the public service and what that means for the public's conception of citizenship in the public service, to the work of the private sector and consulting and some of the challenges that we're seeing in governance, and my perspectives about the public service workforce. So I'd like to open it up now to discussion from the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions and answer. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts, colleagues here, on how some of the different dynamics we've each spoken about relate to one another, and how you see kind of the commonalities and differences among our perspectives.
I'll start. Tina, just to reinforce something you said, I think emphasizing the nobility of public service is really important. You talked about bureaucracy bashing, you talked about the sort of negativity and cynicism that is directed toward government, and I think that is deeply problematic, and it becomes self-fulfilling. People are critical of government, they see our institutions as failed institutions that don't get anything done, they have less confidence in them, and then they don't participate. They don't vote, they don't empower their elected officials or other public servants to enact new and novel approaches to governance, and so government is hindered in its ability to inject creativity into the process. So it becomes self-fulfilling, and I think the only way to meaningfully combat that is for those who are in the work, those that do commit themselves to public service, to figure out the best ways to inject that sort of creativity and then communicate about it. We bemoan the difficulties of the 24-hour news cycle and social media, and how that is sort of anathema to a lot of the complexities that we see in public policy making. That just means that the work of public policy making is more complex, and that we have to be better at it. We have to change the way that we do it, and if we can't, then that cycle will continue. That cycle of negativity will continue. If communicating in sound bites is the way that we're going to reach people, then we have to figure out how to do that better. Easier said than done, of course, but I see the sort of negative feedback loop as something that is very damaging, and if anything, our current federal administration is reinforcing that. Committed public servants who are focused on evidence-based policy making, who are focused on new data-based approaches in this arguably post-fact environment that we find ourselves in, that's the challenge as I see it for this generation of public servants.
Yeah, I mean, I would focus on two quick things. I think one of the things you said, which I really liked, was, teaching students to think about context, right? Every problem, when you sub-optimize, it seems, very solvable at some superficial level, right? But the problem is none of these issues, you can't isolate them anymore, right? They're crisscrossing. And I think having people that are able to step away from the immediate problem they're looking at and start to look at what's really going on here, what are the real drivers behind the issue, is something that gets lost a lot. And again, I could point to specific examples throughout many different environments in my career where just being able to step back and say, what really is motivating the behaviors here? Great example. I think there are often times where people talk about turf battles in the federal government. In my experience, turf battles are 10% bad attitude, but 90% I don't know what the other guy is doing. So I will mistrust as a general rule of thumb until I figure that out. And once they know what the other one's doing, collaboration is really possible, right? So it's revealing where you have common interests versus dispute. And I think people with context who can bring that bigger perspective are important. I think on the evidence-based side, I think one problem I see often is that when do we have a party when a policy's actually worked? Right? You know, meaning I think, you know, we can look at the evidence, but we don't celebrate things that really work. And I was joking with people before this, you know, I've been in 2 groups now where people say we should get rid of the National Weather Service because Google and all these other organizations produce the weather. You know, we don't need them anymore. They all get their source data from the National Weather Service, right? So here's this incredible public utility that we have that we don't celebrate. And in fact, people want to cut its budget, right? And so, you know, I think making more success stories, a lot of the innovation that we're living on today started in the government. It didn't start in the private sector. And I think we often ignore that fact now.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank the other 3 panelists for really fascinating talks. I'm a little bit the odd person out in this, but I do have something that I think connects these different papers or different talks, which is first I want to introduce the historical reality that public service was generally thought of extremely well in early and most of 19th century America, and indeed through most of 20th century America. The denigration of public service is a very recent, very, very recent thing. When I started my last project, which involved a lot of research into the custom houses and how the custom houses operated in the 19th century, it's a historical project on smuggling. And when I started out, I had been under the impression that these custom houses were filled with rascals, you know, people who were sort of taking money from the government or taking graft, and that this was the common public perception in the 19th century. And in fact, it is not true at all. The reality is that the people who work in the custom house are revered. Those jobs are very hard to get. They get obituaries in the New York Times, and they're long obituaries. So those jobs are viewed as, in fact, rewards for being an important, educated, significant personage, and holding those jobs was something that was viewed as a very positive thing. It's a very recent thing in American history that we started saying that these people are all whatever, for lack of a better expression, takers from the people, takers from the government. And the second question I have relates to David's talk, which has to do with this question of technology doing our jobs better than humans do. And there is this larger conversation going on now about whether or not bots are going to replace everyone, and what does this mean for the class structure of the United States. And so I guess I think of the problem that you're describing as a problem that's actually part of a much larger problem we face as a society, which is that technology does jobs really well. It really improves our lives in substantial ways, but it may also be undercutting the basis for a shared prosperity that we saw in the mid to late 20th century, a particular sort of understanding of the way America should be shaped with a large, healthy middle class, very little or comparatively little poverty, and an upper class that isn't in total control of the society.
Great, thank you. I'd like to think a little bit more about the impact of history and various trends over time on the public service workforce. So I wonder if, Andrew, if you could talk a little bit about the history and evolution of the civil service and public attitudes towards the civil service and how that has kind of impacted perceptions of citizenship, perceptions of government.
Well, the movement to create a professional civil service is a product of basically the development of partisanship in the United States. So we start seeing in the 1820s the development of a strong binary political system with a winner-take-all, winner-gets the spoils mentality. And so all of the jobs are patronage appointments in that period. Now, that does not mean that there's 100% turnover each election. There are experts in the government that retain their offices through administration after administration, because you couldn't have a custom house running without certain people who are experts. But the reality is that once you start having significant turnover in office, people begin questioning whether or not the offices are going to the best people. You have a more highly educated society, and there's a question of whether people are getting their jobs for political work rather than for their expertise. And so there's a push for there to be basic requirements and the systematization of how we do hiring, decrease in the number of appointments that are political appointments. So I don't want to suggest to you that there's never any criticism of the civil service in the 19th century. There isn't a criticism of public work and patronage. There's always a significant criticism of who gets the jobs and whether or not they're qualified to do that work. But, and this is where I want to be a little pointed, the civil service movement always has within it certain class assumptions. So however meritorious we may view the idea that you have to pass a test, that you have to have certain degrees to get a job, and we may agree that that is necessary in our modern world, the reality on the ground is that some people are losing their jobs simply because they're from a lower social class. And so there's a lot of tension in American society in the late 19th and early 20th century over the relationship between democracy, or egalitarianism, the idea that any person should be able to serve in a public job, and the push to have our workforce be more educated and more respectable. So there's always a tension. Where I think we are at the present, or where we think we've been since 1980, is a much more intense effort to reduce the size of government workforce, to increase their efficiency, and again, maybe that's all to the good. Everybody wants their taxes to be lowered. But the reality is that in the mid-20th century, or between 1950 and 1970, when government employment was at a peak, also coincidentally happens to be the exact period when the American middle class was most robust. And I don't think that's totally a coincidence. I also don't think it's a coincidence that critiques of public service have gotten greater as the workforce has become more diversified and more female. So I do think that one of the reasons why you see this constant division over criticizing first responders, firemen, police officers, people in the United States military, they get no criticism, but teachers get enormous criticism. Teachers' unions, they get enormous criticism. And again, that may reflect the relative danger of those two jobs, but I think it's fair to say that it's partially because teaching is a field in which women operate, and therefore they're viewed as less worthy, more subject to criticism. Okay, I've gone on too long, so that's my long answer to a short question.
It's a great answer. And following up on that for David and Andrew M., it's clear that the public service no longer just means working for a government agency. We have people in the nonprofit sector, the private sector, who are sector switchers, increasingly moving back and forth. And similarly, we have a lot of people who are moving from administrative to political positions and political to administrative positions. So how has this shaped the 21st century public workforce, and what are its implications as we move forward?
Well, I think going back to my reference to our innovation office at City Hall, we saw this. In the hiring that we've done, we hired people, as it turned out, none of them had worked in government before. They had all come from different kinds of work. And so I think that's becoming much more common. I think that will continue. And I'm hopeful that that will do a couple of things. First, I think it'll bring the sorts of skill sets and expertise into government that I mentioned earlier that I think is so needed. I also think that there can be sort of a social or cultural transformation that can take place as more people work in government or work for government in some way that they might not have otherwise, and therefore people's views about government may change, and that may permeate the culture so that we aren't engaged in that sort of bureaucracy bashing. So in my own experience, I've seen that. I've seen the desire for people who don't come from an educational background or training that necessarily speaks to government or public policy in a specific way. And I've seen people who they feel a commitment to do something that is about the greater good rather than self-enrichment or even just professional advancement. There's a real desire on the part of people from all sorts of disciplines and professions to do something that is in keeping with that mission of public service. So I've seen that in my own experience, and I think that there's something very powerful about that, both professionally and in terms of what government can deliver in terms of service, but also in the context of how views will shift and perhaps could shift as it relates to the work of government. David, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll unpeel this a little differently. I think part of it is the nature of the work, but I think a big part of it is generational, right? Which is, I think that promise not to turn this into a millennial bashing speech here, right? I think what's really interesting is that the people entering the workforce today want multiple experiences, right? And so I think you would have seen this tendency even if both sectors were places they absolutely want to work, right? So, and I think it's to real benefit to both entities. So I can tell you as a person who's only worked in one sector, as soon as I see someone come from the government who works in a place that I want to work with, client I want to work with, I try to extract as much out of that brain as I can because I really want to understand the environment that I'm trying. You can't be a good consultant without understanding the environment you're going into. But interestingly, about 50% of the people that I've hired right out of grad school, as an example, end up in government after 2 to 3 years of booze out, okay? And they walk into the government eyes wide open, right? They've worked with government clients, they understand the work environment, but they bring a set of experiences in that they're not learning on the job. They have seen how government really works, and they're still motivated in a lot of ways to go in. And there's a specific reason. The real difference, we can say that these sectors are blending, but the truth here is that as a private sector person, I don't make regulatory decisions and I don't make budget decisions. I advise. A lot of people that end up leaving the private sector to go into government are folks they want that decision-making authority and a responsibility. And I think the two things I always find interesting about millennials, and by the way, I think Gen X people, I'm a Gen Xer, I think we're exactly the same. We just like to blame millennials and say they're job searching, even though we all job switch, right? So, but I think that there's two things that I've really keyed in on is there's a strong desire for understanding expectations going into a job and a strong desire to be held accountable. And I think what's great about job switching is that if you know the environment you're going into, those expectations are much more realistic. And so I think in both cases, the movement to me is a virtuous cycle. I think you guys were nice to call it sector switching. In DC, we often hear it as the revolving door, right? That's the phrase we hear a lot, right? And I think sector switching is a very positive thing, especially at the more junior levels. I think when you get up to the more political levels, I can see why people have some issues with that. Fear of influence peddling and things like that. But the reality is at a junior level, I think we're really benefiting this generation of people by allowing them to seamlessly flow between these sectors, to include the nonprofit sector. It's very important.
Absolutely. Great. Well, all of my colleagues and students know that I'm a big believer in engagement, so I promise I'm going to turn it over to questions from the audience in just a moment. But I have one last question for all of you, and that is, what do you see as being, I want to end on a positive note. What do you see as being some of the greatest opportunities, or what do you believe holds the most promise for the public service? And what are your hopes for a public service workforce as we move into the third decade of the 21st century and beyond?
Okay, I'll start, I guess. I think to the governor's point about a new generation, and I'm a little biased in this regard, I suppose, but I think a new generation that whether they're going to commit themselves to this sort of work in the private sector or the nonprofit sector or in government, that there is this greater sense of public service and what it means to be engaged in civic life in the context of the American experiment. I have a lot of hope about that, looking at a new generation of people coming up, what their interests are, what their expertise is turning into. We think about all the ways that the work at a school like Maxwell and other parts of the university and universities across the country, the way that curriculum is changing, the way that practices are changing. This generation is going to be as empowered as any generation in history to do that work in new ways and in cross-sector ways that I think are important. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I think as people commit themselves to public service, and I'm hopeful that people will continue to do so directly within government, I think the sector switching is good for the reasons that David and I just talked about. But at the end of the day, the accountability rests with our government institutions and our elected leaders. And so people have to be ready for that lifestyle and that sort of incentive structure. So for a generation that's very talented and culturally competent and skilled, how do we say to them, well, why don't you sign up to get involved in public service and work in government? The pay is so-so, benefits are kind of going away, and you're going to get beaten up in the public and the media all the time. Sound great? Like, please sign up. And I think we still have a generation of people that are ready and willing to do that and to take that heat because it is consequential. It is consequential to society and to that American experience. So that's what gives me hope. I think we do have a generation of people that recent events perhaps reinforcing in strange ways the importance of public service.
There is no hope. No, I'm not. One of the things about being a historian is that you recognize this too shall pass. Every era has its crises. Every era has its problems. Every time someone suggests things were better in the past, I remind them of the things that were not absolutely better and were absolutely worse. It's not a declension. It's not an ascension necessarily either. So I guess I would say to you, if I were to be positive and had to end on a positive note, and it's that A, this too shall pass, and B, this is the richest society that we've ever seen on this planet. So, assuming we don't all fry because of global warming, or there are problems that I do view as existential potentially. The reality is, if we can't figure out how to make government work with the assets that we have, with the resources we have, then I would be very surprised. We have an enormous tax base. If we are able to tap that tax base, we should be able to have a government that works and is effective. And when you add technology to that mix, I think that the potential is actually quite great.
I'll put two on the table that are, again, somewhat generationally oriented. I think the folks, not just millennials, but I think the next generation coming behind them. I'm a father of two 16-year-old twins, right? They're not millennials, they're the next generation. There's a lot more sense of purpose-driven approaches to things, and I think that spirit is, I think, at the core of a lot of what folks in these two generations really believe. And I think that's important. I think, again, as a Gen Xer, we were raised cynically in some ways, right? And I think that has been, and I think we tend to, over time, have become less cynical as a generation, which is a good thing. But I think this generation seems to have more of a purpose-driven approach to how they go at things. I think the other thing that can't be underestimated is they don't really see institutions. They see networks. And I think, what uniform you wear may not really matter in solving these problems in the future, right? And as long as I have connections with people, whether they work for a nonprofit or they happen to now work in a public sector entity or they work in a private sector entity, we're going to get together as a group of people and try to solve problems that way. And to me, that's the great hope is government can't solve these problems itself, and it would be foolhardy to try. Maybe the saving grace for us is going to be less the organizations and institutions and the networks that underlie them. And I think that is a positive. And I think that all of us are connecting in ways that we could not have when Henry Ford gave us a way to build the federal government in 1940 or whatever, right? It's a different modality, right? So that to me is a very hopeful sign.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'd love to open it up to the audience for questions. I believe we have microphones on either end, so start out right here. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for your panel. I'm Margaret Cope, an independent consultant, but I have a background in the military and the public sector. But my question is, to have a respectable dialogue, we need to have a common lexicon. And I've heard the terminology public sector used in a numerous ways. Do we have a definition that we're using for public sector, national service? Does it include the military? Is it by what work you do, or is it by who pays your check? How do you define these aspects?
I'll do the classic consulting thing and answer a different question with my answer. Okay, so I think public sector, there are a lot of ways to define it. I think the thing that I tend to, when I have new staff come aboard, this is the way I describe it. And maybe this is right, maybe this is wrong, but the job we're in is to serve a public good, right? So the government programs that are set up are designed to service the public in some way, shape, or form, and the policies that are written. And we always want to keep that mission focus in mind. And to me, again, what uniform you wear to get to that public good is that's a detail on the journey, but it's not necessarily that important as long as you get to that point. And so I tend to say that if you're someone who's really pushing to move towards a public good. So I'll use something, before coming here, I spent all night on Monday night at an opioid event, right, where we were talking about the opioid epidemic. And there are just so many different opinions and so many different directions people can go. But the reality is we as a society really do, I think, are really starting to grasp the gravity of the problem. And I think it's taken a while for people, people in West Virginia, people in other states may have seen it earlier than others. So again, the public good here is to reduce that epidemic. And I think if you're serving that end, you're a public servant. And another way to say it is if I'm a parent and I go to a PTA meeting, I'm probably a public servant in some way, shape, or form because I'm contributing to the public dialogue. But I'm not a public servant in the way you're talking about the civil service, right, which is a slightly different kind of thing.
Well, and I was defining it literally by people who were getting their check signed by a member of government. And I admit that when I was hearing you talk, I was a little embarrassed because, of course, the statistics I cited are statistics that don't account for the hundreds of thousands, nay, millions of contractors who currently do a lot of the work. One of the reasons the federal civil service has declined per capita, I think it's about the same as it was in 1950 in absolute terms, and it's declined on a per capita basis, is because we have a lot of people who are working as contractors doing that same work in a more flexible way. So my definition was pretty much straightforward, and I included people in the United States military as well as police officers, firefighters, people of all different types, not just clerks. So I was using a very literal definition, and I admit that maybe because I'm just a literal guy. I don't know.
I would just say that I think you're absolutely right. Defining our terms, making sure that everybody is on the same page is absolutely critical. And when I do engagement work or I do collaborative work, whether I'm leading or participating in it, that's one of the first things I do, is to make sure we're all on the same page. But as we're speaking about these things more broadly, I'm not sure that it's necessary to have a definition of the public service that all Americans buy into. I mean, I tend to think about it as people who are working towards the societal good, towards the public good. But in those specific conversations about challenging issues, defining our terms and being on the same page is absolutely critical. Other questions? Yes.
Michael Seltzer again. I neglected to say I'm with Baruch College, City University of New York, the Austin W. Marks School of Public and International Affairs. We just got a gift of $35 million, so I have to give the full name. And our current president, Mitch Wallerstein, sends his greetings and regrets he can't be today, the former dean of Maxwell. Can I ask an international question? We come from a country and also as a New York City resident of exceptionalism. It has to be born in our backyard. And I'm looking at governance as an issue. And my question is, how much is the door ajar to open to guest government's practices that are not born in the United States? I think of one major example. We have an incredible movement in New York around citizen participatory budgeting that's been very successful. That, for those of you who don't know, started in Brazil, went to other 12 countries before it flourished as well in New York. So I ask, if you put an international, what can we learn from what's going outside the United States that will be that we can draw some satisfaction from in terms of what we can do here?
You know, a lot of people think globalization is a negative phenomenon, and I think it has both positive and negative things. Historically, we've thought about the work of government and government practices as being exported from the United States and from Western countries to the rest of the world. But I think because of globalization and new information technologies and the speed of transportation, I go to every international conference I can get funding from my dean to go learn from other people. I think we're learning about practices. PB is a great example of how ideas from other parts of the world have been imported to the West. Some of the most innovative public engagement practices beyond PB are happening in Korea. I think we've seen changes in how we think about the use of data and technology from other places. So I think the door is opening, and over the next several decades it will open more, and it's something that we need to embrace both in our teaching and our training and in our workforce. Anyone else? I think there was a question on this side of the room.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth DeJoseph. I am an MPA student here currently. I'm really enjoying this discussion about having a public sector workforce that is more agile and is willing to work in various sectors. But what I'm interested in knowing is what that means for the majority of government employees who are protected by by unions, and what it means for them to have these important union protections, but at the same time be asked to do things that might kind of run counter to what is part of their contract. So how do we encourage innovation, but at the same time respect these important protections that many of our public sector workers have?
Well, I want to distinguish between two things. There are the civil service protections that workers have, for instance, in the federal government, where they have civil service protections, they can't be fired after a certain point. And those are distinct from union protections, which vary state by state. Some states allow public sector unionization, others don't. And the only defense I would make of it is that the problem if you're a public worker and you're in many of these states is that the state is it's a monopsony. It has the total power over what you make and your conditions of work. And sometimes the people running your state may in fact be either incompetent or corrupt or simply abusive and partisan. And so as a result, what the union does is it gives you some sort of countervailing power against that monopsony effect. But the reality is there is no perfect system. I mean, again, ideally what you'd have is you'd have perfect politicians, you'd have a force that had certain protections but was also agile and was capable of moving back and forth. And what instead we get is a sort of swinging back and forth between giving people probably too much protection, making it impossible for them to be fired, swinging from that to arguing that they should have no protections and that they should be completely subject to the whim of Scott Walker. Oh wait, I've said too much. I mean, I'm saying, you know, that they're so it's a balance, and rather than swinging back and forth between having administrations that are just whole hog attacking civil service protections, attacking public sector unions, attacking legally the possibility of public sector unionization, and at the same time having a system which, again, doesn't give people so much protection that you have, you know, teachers in rubber rooms and tenure protections which protect teachers who are completely incompetent. So in other words, it's a balance, and instead we're kind of swinging back and forth, I feel like.
I agree that it's a balance. Part of this discussion, I think, has to be about, going back to my point earlier about the burden of leadership. This is a matter of leadership, to make reform within civil service, to expand the definition of the skills and talents that need to be represented in public organizations, and integrating that with civil service and how we define those job descriptions, and then investing in people. I think this is something that we see as a huge challenge in public organizations, is there isn't professional development in government institutions in the same way that there's professional development in the private sector. I see that as a huge problem. That's something we were just talking a little bit about earlier and last night as well. That is the way that institutions are going to evolve, that there's going to be greater creativity. That has to be led by someone, though. That has to be a matter of the conversation, the political conversation about government effectiveness. And if government institutions are going to be effective, then we have to invest in the people that make public policy happen. So it is a matter of leadership and standing up and saying that's something that is worthy of the taxpayer dollar. That's worthy of public resource to invest in reforming civil service, to expanding the definition of what it means to be a public servant, and then investing in the people that choose to make public service their life's work.
Yeah, I mean, just to add one thing, and it's a little bit of a variation of your question, but I think it's important, is that we've talked a lot about how it's great to have the public and private sectors come together. But these protections are important for a couple of reasons. And so I'm talking more about government contracting and consulting. But if you go into the regulatory realm, right, there's a good reason why you want some strong segregation in those responsibilities, right? And, you know, I'm always interested in reading reports about how many SEC people end up in, you know, in large banks, as an example, right? And so I think that, you know, part of the reason you want a civil service that has these protections is that without it, you're going to see the idea of the revolving door is only going to get worse, right? You know, there's only so much money that someone can turn down at some point before they're going to switch. And I think you want to have people who feel secure in their position, who can make a good living doing what they're doing, and they want to do, at the end of the day, what they went into government to do. A lot of these folks didn't go into regulation because digging into, codes of federal regulation is a lot of fun, right? I mean, they're in it because they want to change how these industries are regulated. And I think so when we talk about private sector, in my commentary, it's around one segment, but when you look at the bigger picture, I do worry about this division between the regulator and the regulated. And a pure partnership, to me, blurs a line that maybe we don't want blurred. And I think you're going to see some of that in sectors where the FAA is a good example, where they've been criticized for decades for being both an advocate for industry and a regulator of industry. And it's a really hard position to be in. And my client, CMS, is facing that now a little bit, where they're being asked to partner with industry at the same time they regulate industry. That's a very challenging tightrope, I think, for federal employees to walk.
I would just add that I think we need to vociferously protect, respect, and defend our public institutions in the civil service, our citizenship institutions, our governance institutions, our democratic institutions. It is all too easy to turn on the news or open a newspaper and read a story about how government is failing or how we have these ethical violations and corrupt politicians. And when we have ethical violations and corruption, we should go after that, absolutely. But we also need to tell the stories of the great things government does, whether it's the National Weather Service, to all of the work of NASA. How great is NASA and the work that they're doing? I was talking with Dustin Brown about the amazing advances we've made in automation and saving paper and all sorts of good things. And it's hard to find those stories. The more we can tell about the good that government does, the more people will be willing, I think, to respect government and support government, and the less willing they'll be to help erode those institutions that make our society function. There was a question over here earlier, so we could go to this gentleman.
Thank you. I'm Charles Winfield. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at Rutgers University. Our university is very much a public service type university. The chancellor strongly encourages public engagement and so forth. And I've heard some phrases, like conflict management, organizational change, public values. Those are the sorts of things that we hear quite a bit. But when I think about traditional universities and colleges, there's English departments, history departments, and everyone exists in their silos. But today we're asking people to do a whole bunch of things given the dynamic nature of the society that we live in. So my question to you is, from a pedagogical perspective, how do we cross those borders? Because, society is not completely ready, in my opinion, for public engagement the way that we're doing it at Rutgers and the way that you're doing it here at Syracuse. How do you convince people, both students and faculty, that it's important to collaborate, not just with the bureaucratic entities where you exist, but also entities on your campus? Like, how do you teach students that it's important to know what's going on in public health, or combining public health and public affairs, or combining criminal justice and public affairs, those sorts of things? From a pedagogical perspective, how do we break out of the traditional silo of let's just teach what we know?
That's a
tough
great
one.
question. I think that students are easily persuaded, and maybe this is being a little naive. We have students here, I should make one of them answer the question. But I think that they can see the need to work across disciplinary boundaries, across fields to understanding problems. We can't just do transportation policy analysis without being able to talk to engineers. We can't think about solving health crises without looking at people who have masters in public health degrees, or who are epidemiologists, or who have other fields. So I think that they understand the need. I think the bigger challenge is on our side. As institutions, how do we create opportunities for interdisciplinary learning? As instructors, how do we build those into our courses? How do we bring people like Andrew, who's a historian, into courses to teach about the history of the civil service, or people like David and Andrew M., who have these different perspectives? And I know that this interdisciplinary thing is something that we really value at Maxwell. I think we do a good job at it, and it is certainly not easy. The onus is on us. I don't think the onus is on students.
Well, and I will say that in Maxwell, we do have the Max classes, Max 132 and 123, both of which are interdisciplinary classes taught by multiple faculty from the Maxwell School, which students take and students love, which have small groups as well as large lectures. So we have tried to do that, and I think at the Honors College, which is actually based in this building, I think, they offer classes which are built around a particular problematic or a particular subject. So, it could be something as broad as, say, man versus nature, and you have a class where you deal with that in literature. So you read Moby Dick, but then you talk about history, you talk about environmental policy, and you try and engage with all of those things in a, so you're engaging with a problem or with a broad subject. And I apologize if my broad subject wasn't perfect, but so people are trying to do these things. The question is, how do you get professorial buy-in for them? With the Max classes, as Dave and Andrew will tell you, it's sometimes very difficult to convince faculty to sort of give up the thing they do well and they know well to teach this class that's a group design class where they're not necessarily in their comfort zone. It's a lot easier to do what you do well and stick with that rather than focusing on these broad things. And sometimes they have to be bribed in order to get them to do it. A bribe is a dirty word. I don't know. Given, you have to reward people.
As another example, we recently had a course in Maxwell taught by an engineering professor, and this course was focused on infrastructure, public-private partnerships. So we had engineering students who were really focused on management techniques, and students who were focused on policy techniques. And my understanding is that it was very hard to get them to communicate with each other because they didn't have the same language. But once they understood where everyone was coming from, the class was really successful. So I think building things like that with those cross-field listings, I don't know, there's a technical term for that, but I'm not in administration, so I don't know it.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll say is in the practicality of when you interview students and when you put them to work, in their first 2 or 3 years, I don't care what environment you're in today, you're in a multidisciplinary environment. There are very few places where you're going to go and do exactly what you studied, right? And I think the thing that I would encourage, faculty to think about over time as somebody who inherits a lot of these students, right, is the more critical thinking you can throw at them, the better, because everything changes. No one was talking about data analytics at this level 5 years ago, right? There's a huge trend in our consulting business to do design thinking. What is design thinking? Can anyone tell me? Yeah, it's called thinking really critically about a problem from every perspective, right? So we created this wonderfully branded methodology to say, think harder about this problem, right? And so, I would just encourage, use your classes. So, great example, when I recruit undergrads, I don't even look at the degree, right? I'm looking at some of the other experiences they have. The best students I get sometimes are people who have an anthropology degree. Why? Because they're exceptional observers, right? When you're a consultant, you've got to observe. That's what you're paid to do, right? So I think the degrees are certainly important. I'm not saying they're not, but I think it's really the core underlying skill set. The other thing is, if you ask somebody to write more than 144 characters, it can be a struggle. Like, I'm not saying people who are in policy programs or in liberal arts programs, it's not. You get out of the liberal arts field, it is a show what people write. And they don't know how to really communicate. And I was in a meeting with
how to text.
Yeah, they 144 characters. They got that down, right? But when you and here's an example: is I was in a meeting with an executive vice president with all new staff, people we brought in, and they said, "What's the number one skill I need to succeed in this business?" And he said, "You need to know how to write." And I think so I think really working on people to hone those critical analytic skills in written form, regardless of degree, is really important.
I just want to say one thing relative to what you were saying about anthropology degrees. I taught this wonderful program called the Warrior Scholar Program, where you teach people who are recently demobilized from the military, and they're guys who are, and some women as well, who are preparing to go to college. And so they come and they do like a mini class with us. And one of them told me that his absolute best officer, these guys are all enlisted men, his absolute best officer had been a theater major in college. So it's not necessarily the case that the people who have a major that's an obviously practical major are necessarily the best leaders or the best critical thinkers best at what, these jobs.
And at the risk of filibustering, I mean, I think what we're seeing is we're seeing degrees that, you know, things like music, linguistics, computer science, that, you know, mathematics, that have underlying logics that look the same, right? So some of our best data scientists are people who come from the linguistic field, right? Because they understand underlying logic patterns. That's what you need to write an algorithm, right? So I think, again, the degree, it's really the style of thinking that you're looking for as much as the degree. But it is hard to break those barriers down, even in organization, not just academia. In our own company, we got people, I'm an expert in this. And like this can become yesterday's news very quickly, right, in the consulting business, right? And so breaking those walls down is really important.
I agree with that. The only thing I would add is that I think it's largely a degree of, it's a matter of orientation. I think Maxwell is really good at this, where if the orientation is disciplinary in nature, then I do think you see that kind of siloing. But if the orientation is about the outcome in the world, if it's about the impact on the client or on communities, then you are, I think, inherently led into the multidisciplinary conversation. And that's certainly in keeping with my Maxwell experiences and with people like Professor Van Slyke and my work when I was in the program. If you focus on the end user, if you focus on the customer, so to speak, the outcome in the world, if that's your focus, that is where you begin to cross disciplines, and that's the power I see in that.
Yes.
I'm totally astounded by how fast things are moving today. And as I listen to this, and I think back to 1969, 70, 71, I'm really dating myself here, when I was a grad student getting my PhD in economics and public administration here. And fortunately had the chance of working with Eggers quite a bit. I reflect on where I was less than a week ago, and that was in Los Angeles, invited to listen to two of the world's billionaires, one of them running a $400 billion private equity fund, facing the reality also of the other person on the stage, influenced by the 1968 riots in Los Angeles, and also one of the wealthiest people in the world. Their views are really so different. Both of them have, as one of the people been most completely influential on them, was Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who was a friend of both of them. The whole question really revolves around the leadership and the question of how you view yourself. And that was the theme of a lengthy discussion. And the people in the room, I don't know how many other multi-billionaires there were, but it was mostly people like that. And I hope that in academia we can begin to understand how fast and out of touch very often we are with the tremendous imbalance of private equity versus public equity. Because when you're talking to people like this that manage and are interacting with budgets larger than most states and many nations, we need to begin to look at what they're looking at. And interestingly enough, the view was they're looking for people who view themselves as interested and committed leader citizens. And I would encourage you to begin to think about the degree to which you push, as you're teaching, the whole concept of, do you know who you are? Do you know what you want? Are you committed to your role in society? Do you have a set of principles that you know and understand? These are all themes I was listening to these people talk about. And so it ends up very often being an existential dialogue with the students about waking up and understanding that the world is moving so fast And there's the old adage that you can, you think you're moving fast and you're changing, but even a dead man can keep up with change. All you have to do is throw him in the river. So the reality is your roles are crucial to confront the students with the reality of their own existential and ideological commitment to themselves in knowing what they want and how they're going to act on their society.
I agree. Right? And I think, for a lot of my teaching, it is not just skills oriented. I think there are very practical skills that our students need to learn, but it's also about higher order reasoning. It's about having a vision, and I think people sometimes pshaw idealism, and I like to tell students that we need to be idealistic. We need to have the vision of where we want to go so that we know if we're on the right path. And that doesn't mean being naive. But it means having sound ethical principles. It means understanding your values. It means having the motivation, drive, and stamina to keep working for the betterment of society, even when that's challenging, and even when it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So I agree. And I'd love to get in the room with those people and talk to them. So, learn from them and help them learn from us. Let's make that happen someday. We have time for a few more questions, if there are any?
Morning. My name is Rob Carty. I'm with the International City County Management Association, and I bring greetings from Mark Ott, who is actually in New Zealand with our affiliate there this day. One of the things that strikes me about trying to prepare for the workforce of the future is to make government sound more attractive. And one of the things you mentioned was you had 320 applicants for an innovation job. I recently worked with a community in Colorado who had 0 applicants for a management assistant or intern job. And what can we do to make, so it sounds like people wanted to do that because it sounded exciting. Yes. So we hire for someone that maybe I need some data analytics and performance measurement or management skills and some strategic consulting and innovation advice to departments. We call that management analyst 2. Nobody knows what that is. So do we need to do more to make it not just exciting, but even understandable to applicants to apply for these jobs as we prepare to attract people into the future? Thank you.
Yes, that is such an important point. And in my experience with the Innovation Office, I'll admit these 3 positions that we were hiring for, they were not civil service positions. These were positions that we created as a way to fit the mold of this innovation culture that we were looking to adopt. And that culture and the titles associated with them, the work as we talked about it publicly, people did find it exciting. And so we were able to attract a very deep pool of candidates who were very talented, very committed to the idea of public service, and they were attracted to doing exciting work. They weren't attracted because of the pay or the idea of job security. It was about doing exciting work. So I think that's exactly right. We have to change the way we talk about government work. We have to change the way we talk about these titles. Updating titles, it seems superficial, but it is a very big deal when it comes to attracting and retaining talent in public organizations. So that's something that's going to have to be done at every level. So leadership locally, at the state level, nationally, that has to be done. And I think it speaks to people being elected into government work who understand government work. I think a lot of elected leadership maybe don't even understand that discussion is a thing and something that should be taken on and changed. So that has to be elevated in different ways. I don't have the exact answer to that, but I do think it is a matter of leadership to a large degree.
David, any thoughts on that?
No, I'm often competing against government for people, so I have no suggestions here.
I'll just say one thing that's totally seems maybe the way in which titles matter. We talk about this all the time when we talk about getting enrollments for classes, and having your title be something that people would actually be interested in. And you probably won't be surprised to hear that a lot of professors aren't very good at marketing their own classes, even if they're stimulating in nature, because they're not trained to do marketing. And sometimes they'll get rid of a course title that works, they'll change it to something they think is more accurate historically, and then their enrollment plummets. So I remember I had a colleague who came in and he inherited a course called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This guy was an ancient historian, and he hated that title because it's the title of a famous book by Gibbon, and he didn't feel it was accurate description of what actually happened in Roman history. So he got rid of the title, and of course the enrollment fell to the floor, And so 2 years later, he brought back the old title, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. All of a sudden, the enrollments went back up. So, these titles matter a lot more. It's annoying, but the reality is we're all marketers for ideas on some level. I wish it weren't so, but salesmanship sort of enters into everything.
Yeah, I mean, one thing maybe that government can do a little more than I think it does is it tends to be viewed as, well, I'm going to go into the government and that's what I'm going to do for the next 25 years, right? And so maybe, and it sounds like the innovation positions are a great example where, hey, maybe that's a stepping stone to something else. And I think if government roles were maybe thought of a little bit more sometimes that way, you might attract more candidates. I'll say, if you go onto usajobs.gov, I doubt there's a position on there that doesn't get 10 times the number of applicants they think. So I think a lot of people do want to work in government. I think the process is mysterious to them, though. The selection process and other things at the federal level, I think, that dissuades people. Maybe they try once or twice and it wasn't transparent to them how decisions were made, and they kind of drop off that eligible workforce very quickly.
I think we have time for one last question.
I'm Rich Wilhelm. I'm retired, but I spent 16 years at the same firm, full disclosure, that Dave Slyke did, but had a full career in government before that, both in the military and on the civilian side, at some at very senior levels. I had the opportunity maybe 10 years ago to lead a large group at the consulting firm around analytics, and so I'd like to return for a minute to the subject of data and data science. At that time, and I think it was McKinsey, put out a great report saying there was a huge shortage of data scientists in this country. I think some of that's being rectified. But the more important problem is that there was a huge shortage of data-savvy managers and leaders. And what they were saying is that it doesn't do any good just to have better analytics around the data and getting the right data if you have managers who are not willing to accept the results of those data because it punctures a hole in the preconceived notions of what they thought the solution to the problem was. And, I can talk about climate change. I can talk about, hey, the solution to terrorism is killing as many terrorists as you can, and, that seems to be part of the problem, but that doesn't kill terrorism at all. In fact, the data shows it's exactly the opposite. So I think my question to you, not being in government anymore or not being in a senior management position, is that beginning to change? Is are leaders more willing to embrace the enormous changes that have been made in terms of our ability to deal with data and the analytical tools that we have to get through a lot of relevant data and to have the right algorithms that ask the right questions?
So I'll start. All right. So I think I'll answer it in sort of a couple different ways, I think, real quickly. I think one, are there more data savvy managers in government? There are. But there's still, one of the things, I'll return to the evidence-based policy dialogue we've sort of had is, what I've learned very quickly in looking at this issue is there's 4 communities out there that kind of think they're solving the same problem but aren't. The first are people that build data systems and IT systems that collect it, and they're doing what they do. And then there's a set of people that worry about the privacy protections around that data, and they're doing what they can. And those privacy protections, for good reasons, restrict access to that data, right? Then there's a set of policymakers who want the output. They want the number to spit out an answer so they can go make a decision. And then there are researchers who are really diving deep into that data. And these communities don't communicate well at all together, in my estimation. I work at CMS today at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I work with the Innovation Group. They have 70 different models where they're testing new ideas. And these communities come together all the time in very inartful ways and it's no fault of anyone. It's an emerging area. And I think that, again, what I said earlier is true, is that the data sometimes you really need to make the decision doesn't exist yet. And so I think part of what policymakers and researchers have to do is drive some of that back into the equation. And my little analog for this is I went to a conference, Informs, which is a big analytics group that one of the first analytics-oriented professional organizations. I went to it, and I went to a panel because I was fascinated by the title, which was How to Communicate with Normal People. That's literally the title of the session, right? Because all they're doing is crunching numbers all the time, right? And they're like, look, it's 7. The answer is 7. And to a policymaker, it makes no sense. There's no context for them to understand what you're really saying to them. And so I think there is a communication gulf that has to be closed. What I've been heartened by, and I won't use Syracuse as an example here. I recruited a school in Virginia, and 2 years ago we told them, wow, yeah, you don't have anybody who understands data science. I looked at 200 resumes in the last couple of weeks from this school, half of whom now they are experienced in programming Python or R. 2 years, right? That is an enormous transformation. And it's because what's the demand signal they're getting? Demand signal is you're not going to get your folks hired unless they have that skill set. And so I think that's what you're starting to see. And most of those people are not going to code the rest of their life. They're going to be, but you can't be a policymaker and not understand. I work on a program today where we, about every other week, find a coding error because someone didn't understand the policy they were trying to code against, right? Only a policy person's going to find that error. The coder's never going to find it because they're not worried about that. They're just about making sure that the do loop works consistently, right? So I think, but I think bridging those worlds is pretty critical, and I think we're just at the ground floor of bridging those universes together.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of my esteemed panelists. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights with us. I want to thank the Dean's Office and Dean Van Slyke for helping to organize this panel, Governor Whitman for being here as our keynote speaker, Dr. Tanner for helping to support all of this. But most of all, I want to thank all of you in the audience for coming and participating today. I think we'll have a break now, followed by lunch. Dean Van Slyke, do you want to say anything?
We're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to reconvene and have lunch from 12 to 12:30, and then from 12:30 to 1:45. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.
So what classes do you teach?